Alright guys, welcome back to our second video on the Civil War. This is APUSH topic 5.9. I promise you this will be much shorter than the last one, although there is still a lot of content we need to get through. So anyhow, let's get into it. We're going to focus on the government policies during the Civil War, and we're going to focus obviously heavily on the North. Alright, so let's think about Abraham Lincoln and his leadership and what impact that had on the Civil War. And that's going to bring us back to something we looked at in the last video, which was the Emancipation Proclamation. So if you have forgotten, this is something that Lincoln announces after the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, and it goes into effect on the first day of 1863. What this thing, and by the way, let me back up, this is not a law passed by Congress, by the way. This is what we call an executive order. And what this does is it declares, and these are the words, forever free slaves in the Confederate States that are still under rebellion. So there are some exceptions here for slaves being freed. If you are an enslaved person living in a border state, like say Kentucky, you're not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. If you are living in, say, Middle Tennessee, and you're an enslaved person and you're already under Union control, you're not immediately freed either. This only affects areas that were under rebellion in the areas in red on the map here. Now, obviously, what that means is that it doesn't really free any slaves, in the sense that the Union doesn't have any control in these red areas. That's why they're in rebellion. However, once word spreads of this proclamation, and it's something like this is going to spread like wildfire, thousands of slaves all across the South are going to simply leave. They're going to emancipate themselves by getting off the plantation and finding their way to Union lines. So as the Union Army would start passing through an area, they would run to the Union Army and say, I used to be a slave and I'm free now, and that's it. This is my freedom. So the Emancipation Proclamation, while it didn't necessarily free a lot of slaves legally speaking, what it does do is it changes the purpose of the war. Remember, early on in the war, Lincoln's goal was to save the Union. That's still his goal, but a secondary goal now is to also end slavery. And once this is on the books, again, the Emancipation Proclamation is, it's kind of more than the sum of its parts, in the sense that this is going to have a lot of impact across the world, because European countries, knowing that fighting a fight for the South is a fight to save slavery, is something that really makes them kind of uncomfortable, especially with the Union saying that slavery in the South is going to be forever undone. Another component of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it authorizes the enlistment of black soldiers. So now we can call on black Northerners and freed slaves to fight on the behalf of the Union to end slavery. And that, in fact, is our next topic. So even though there was a lot of opposition to this, Lincoln does push forward and authorize the enlistment of black soldiers. And by the end of the war, 180,000 black soldiers will have been enlisted. Now, not all of them are going to see combat, because there was still this idea that black soldiers, really weren't up to the task of fighting. And so, while certainly some of them will see combat, not all of them will. A good example, one that did, is probably the most famous of these units. It was called the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This was organized near Boston and other parts of Massachusetts. It's the subject of a pretty famous Civil War movie called Glory, which is an excellent movie. I definitely highly recommend it. And this regiment saw really intense combat. Now, think about this from the perspective of either a former slave or a free man in the North. The opportunity to go out there and take the fight to the South, literally take the fight to the South, is got to be enticing, right? And it also gives these black soldiers a chance to prove themselves that, hey, listen, we can fight just as well as white soldiers. Let us show you. And so it really, kind of gives them more self-confidence and opens a lot of eyes, especially in the North. All right, now let's think about maybe non-military African Americans in the South. How are they going to weaken the Confederacy? And let's think about the enslaved population, which is still there. There's lots of ways they can reduce the Confederacy's ability in this war. They can slow down their work even more. They could literally just go on strike or defy their owners because, what are they going to do at this point? The South is crumbling. Also, the potential for a slave revolt was something the South had always been afraid of, but now, especially during war, they're even more afraid of it. And so to kind of keep a lid on that, a militia called the Home Guard was needed behind the lines. And so you've got people who really could have been on the front lines fighting against the Union having to be held back to put down a potential slave revolt. All told, about 500,000 slaves, that's basically 1 out of every 8, will eventually just flee the plantations during the war. All right, now let's get on to, since our topic in this unit, or excuse me, in this section is all about Lincoln's leadership, let's look at his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. So the Battle of Gettysburg took place in July of 1863. By the fall of that year, they were ready to dedicate this new cemetery for, the many, many dead from that battle. And Lincoln was invited almost as an afterthought to, give a few words about the battle. And he follows up an hours-long speech by a famous orator of the day. You can see him right there behind him. And Lincoln gets up and he speaks for a short amount of time, just a couple minutes, saying only about 272 words. So in terms of, length, his speech really is pretty insignificant. But Lincoln is great at crafting his words. And even though it was short, the speech really has a way of kind of encapsulating the whole purpose of America. It's the whole American identity and future is all encapsulated in those stirring words. And he kind of goes on to basically tell us that this is kind of like our moment where we're going to fulfill our ideals. Maybe we haven't lived up to all of our ideals, but we have a chance to do that. And by winning this war, we can give America a new birth of freedom, he calls it. All right, now let's look at Let's look at Abraham Lincoln, not William. Abraham Lincoln as a wartime politician. So Lincoln, he's going to take some measures during this war that were pretty controversial. He's going to expand the power of the executive, probably way more than even Andrew Jackson had done. He's going to do some things without congressional approval, which are, frankly, what he was doing is probably not necessarily constitutionally allowed, but he's going to do it anyways. He's going to set up that blockade. He's going to expand the military. He's going to, and this is probably the most controversial part, he's going to have the writ of habeas corpus suspended, which allows him to arrest people and hold them without charging with them any crime. That is something that can actually be done, by the way, under the Constitution in times of war or rebellion. Now, on the political side, obviously the Republicans are in power under Lincoln, but what about the Democrats? What happened to them? Well, the war divides this party into a couple of different factions. You have one faction that are referred to as war Democrats. These are Democrats, yes, but they're supporting Lincoln's war efforts. So they're siding with Lincoln on most things to win the war. Then there's a group called the Peace Democrats, and the Peace Democrats did not feel that this war was prosecuted in the right way. They didn't think the war should be fought at all. They were opposed to a lot of Lincoln's efforts. And then you have a group of radicals called the Copperheads, and these are people, again, Northern Democrats, who aren't just saying that this war shouldn't be fought. They're actively fighting against the war. They're doing everything they can do to obstruct Lincoln's efforts to fight the war. And this cartoon here, Copperhead, right, like a snake, as in, someone who's going to, kind of a traitor to the North. So this all culminates, guys, in 1864 when Lincoln is up for re-election. What he does is he basically joins up with the War Democrats to form something called the Union Party. Again, this is going to be a union of Republicans and War Democrats. So, yeah, this is going to be basically a one election only political party, which is kind of a weird thing in American history if you really think about it. So Lincoln's big message here was, stay the course. As he said, don't change horses in the middle of a stream. I am doing a good job of prosecuting this war. The war is coming to an end. I think I need a second term to not only finish the war, but also build a peace afterward. Lincoln turns to a man from Tennessee to be his running mate, Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was one of those mountain whites we talked about in our last unit. He's a war Democrat. He had been the Tennessee military governor once Tennessee fell to the Union. And so he seemed like a guy who could maybe win Lincoln some votes, particularly in the border states. Now, the Democrats are going to elect George McClellan, who had been fired by Lincoln, if you recall, the guy who had fought at Antietam. And McClellan's message was basically, vote for me, I'll end the war. Now, he wasn't really specific on how that was going to happen, what would take place, but he's just basically running as the anti-Lincoln. And there was a lot of anti-Lincoln sentiment in the North, for sure. Okay. There's a poster here for the election of McClellan. We're gonna end the war. All right. Well, at the end of the day, Lincoln wins his reelection. Although I will say it was a lot closer than people probably think back to. In fact, Lincoln looked like he might even lose this election not too far away from the actual date of the election. It wasn't until a series of military victories in the South kind of got people turned the other way and say, well, I guess we should give Lincoln, that second term, basically. And with Lincoln's reelection, that is the final nail in the coffin for the Confederacy, because by the fall of 1864, a battlefield victory was not going to happen for the South. Their only hope, really, and it wasn't even foreign intervention that was going to save them, because that wasn't going to happen by 1864 either. Their only hope was that Lincoln would have lost, McClellan would have won, and then done some sort of negotiated peace with the South. Well, that didn't happen, and now it can't happen. So let's jump now to the end of the war. These pictures here of Lincoln are really, I think, very telling. They're taken at the beginning of Lincoln's first term and basically right at the end of the Civil War on the right. So a time period of not quite 4 years. Well, I guess maybe a little bit more than 4 years. And you can tell that the war really took a toll on this guy for sure. As we all know, Lincoln dies less than a week after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 14, 1865. By a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, the guy on the left there. Booth was part of a larger conspiracy. That the plan was to basically to decapitate the Northern leadership the closing days of the war, and then that, in theory, would help the South win, or something. I don't know. I mean, it's a crazy plan, so it was never going to work. And some of those other conspirators who were involved, as you can see here, they were executed. Now, the effect of Lincoln's assassination is pretty stunning. In the North, there had been, even with Lincoln's reelection, there were still a lot of people who thought Lincoln was, not exactly a great president. But as soon as he's killed, I mean, he becomes a martyr. He's celebrated across the North as a great hero. And for the South, this was probably the worst thing that could have happened, because Lincoln, as we're going to get into in our next section, Lincoln had some fairly generous terms for the South. His plan for Reconstruction was not one of vast punishment for the South. And with the South seeming to have Lincoln's blood on their hands, the North is quite angry, and they're quite bitter. Not just over Lincoln's death, of course, but all the other Union soldiers who died to put down the rebellion. So again, Lincoln's assassination, probably not a good thing at all, ironically enough, for the South. All right, guys, there you go. That's the leadership of Lincoln during the war, the political side of things. And in our next video, we'll get into the whole topic of Reconstruction.